In the year 1689, the Great Hall of Westminster stood heavy with silence. Candles cast their light across ancient stones, and the assembled peers of the realm waited as a clerk unrolled a parchment. Upon it were words that would shape the destiny of England. Ink, wax, and the royal seal carried the weight of centuries, for this was the English Bill of Rights. The act was not a simple statute nor a passing proclamation. It was the voice of a people weary of unchecked power, determined that liberty must be bound into law. For a kingdom so old with its roots deep in custom and monarchy, why should such a declaration be needed? To understand, one must travel back across the long shadows of English history to moments where liberty was promised and tested, broken and renewed. The parchment of 1689 did not appear in isolation. It was the child of a lineage that stretched back to a meadow at Runnymede, where in 1215, barons forced King John to seal Magna Carta. That charter was modest in scope, yet immense in meaning. It declared that even a king must obey the law, that no free man should be imprisoned without judgment, that taxation required consent. Magna Carta was not a revolution, but it was a seed. Centuries passed, and kings pressed against its limits. Parliament grew, sometimes silenced, sometimes triumphant. The Tudors consolidated power, binding crown and church together, yet leaving behind divisions unresolved. Elizabeth I gave her people glory in arms and arts, but ruled with caution and authority. When the Stuarts inherited her throne, they inherited also the storm of questions left unanswered. Who truly governed, the monarch or the nation's representatives? The 17th century was to test those questions with fire. In 1642, the kingdom tore itself apart in civil war. Charles I claimed authority by divine right. Parliament declared that law and liberty must stand above the will of one man. The clash was bitter, and its outcome unprecedented. In 1649, the king himself was tried and condemned, and for a season, England lived without monarchy. A commonwealth rose, then faltered. By 1660, the monarchy was restored, yet never again with its ancient certainty. Charles II returned to laughter and feasts, but also to suspicion. The memory of civil war lingered. His brother James II, upon ascending, deepened that mistrust. His rule was marked by defiance of Parliament, favoritism toward Catholic allies, and a heavy-handed vision of authority that many believed threatened the very fabric of English law. This was the inheritance of 1689. Magna Carta and its promises, the bloodshed of the civil wars, the memory of a king executed, the uneasy balance of a restored monarchy. When James fled into exile and William and Mary were called to the throne, Parliament seized its chance to write clearly what had long been contested. The Bill of Rights was born of that necessity. It declared that no monarch could suspend laws or levy taxes without Parliament. It confirmed the right to free elections and free debate within Parliament. It forbade standing armies in peacetime without consent. It enshrined the right of subjects to petition the crown and the assurance that punishments could not be cruel or excessive. These principles did not create democracy, but they marked the beginning of a constitutional monarchy where power was restrained by law. The story of liberty in England is one of struggle, not of gifts freely given. It was wrestled for across centuries, through parchment sealed at sword point, through parliaments dissolved and restored, through a king's trial and a nation's rebellion. The Bill of Rights of 1689 was both a conclusion and a beginning. It gathered the lessons of the past and set them down for the future. From that day forward, the English crown would reign, but it would not rule unchecked. The hall at Westminster echoed with the sound of words read aloud, the Declaration of Rights and Liberties. In those words, England marked a turning point. The parchment was not merely ink and vellum. It was a promise that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, that the law would be stronger than the whim of any sovereign. Liberty was no longer a fragile idea whispered by rebels and barons. It had become the law of the land, and so begins the story of the Bill of Rights, a tale not only of kings and parliaments, but of the people who insisted that freedom must be preserved. It is a story that reminds us still that liberty is never secure unless it is defended, renewed, and remembered. If you find these echoes of the past compelling, consider carrying this journey further, for the struggles of 1689 continue to speak across centuries, shaping the freedoms many of us hold today. But to understand why such a declaration became necessary, one must return a few years earlier to the troubled reign of James II. James II ascended the throne in 1685, a man already shaped by the storms of his family's history. He was the brother of Charles II, the son of the executed Charles I, and the inheritor of all the unresolved tensions between monarchy and parliament. His very life had been marked by the pendulum swings of English politics, royal triumph, royal disgrace, exile, and restoration. Now crowned with the authority of the realm, James intended not merely to reign, but to rule. Yet the shadow that followed him was unmistakable. His open commitment to the Catholic faith in a kingdom where Protestantism had become both religion and identity. England was not only a land of parishes and pulpits, but also a nation haunted by memories of Marian persecutions, Spanish threats, and the long struggles of the Reformation. To many, Catholicism was not simply a personal creed, but a symbol of foreign influence, of papal interference, and of tyranny. When James, unashamed and unwavering, declared his loyalty to Rome, he provoked suspicion that reached across all classes of society. At first, there were those who hoped for moderation. Perhaps James would govern with prudence, balancing faith with duty, law with conscience. But the king's actions quickly dispelled such illusions. He dismissed the warnings of Parliament, issued proclamations without consent, and relied on the royal prerogative as if it were boundless. Where his brother Charles had practiced a cautious dance, veiling intentions, securing allies, James strode forward with blunt certainty. He established Catholic officers in the army, ignored statutes that barred them, and filled positions of authority with those loyal to him rather than to the laws of the kingdom. Cinematically, one might imagine the moment: the king seated at a heavy desk, quill in hand, signing a royal decree. Around him, courtiers looked on, some uneasy, others eager to please. The parchment bore his command, untempered by debate, unratified by Parliament. With each flourish of the quill, James seemed to assert not only his authority, but his conviction that his power came from God alone, unanswerable to the commons, the lords, or even the traditions of his own country. But England in the 1680s was not the England of Henry VIII or Elizabeth I. The realm had tasted a revolution, had seen a monarch brought to trial, had lived through a decade without a king. The memory of those years lingered in the minds of nobles, gentry, merchants, and commoners alike. To them, James's bold decrees carried an echo of danger. The laws of the land were not ornaments to be brushed aside. They were protections hard won, the very framework of stability. As months passed, James's disregard grew more visible. He sought to suspend laws that restricted Catholics, claiming the dispensing power of the crown. He issued a declaration of indulgence, granting freedom of worship, not through Parliament, but by royal command. To many Protestants, even those inclined toward tolerance, this was less an act of generosity than a challenge to constitutional order. Freedom granted by a monarch's whim could as easily be revoked. True liberty, they believed, must rest in law, not in the pleasure of a sovereign. The king's circle narrowed. Those who counseled caution found themselves pushed aside. Those who echoed his vision gained favor. He summoned judges to enforce his will, reshaped charters of towns and corporations, and reminded all that loyalty to the crown was the first duty of the subject. Yet the more he pressed, the greater the unease. From the pulpits of Anglican churches to the halls of the Inns of Court, murmurs rose. Was this not the very road to absolutism? James did not see himself as a tyrant. In his own mind, he was a monarch fulfilling duty, guided by conscience, seeking unity under the authority of the throne. But perception is often as powerful as intent, and the perception among his people was clear. He was a king who would not listen, who would not bend, who placed his personal creed above the common law of England. By the late 1680s, the stage was set for confrontation. Parliament, long suspicious, bristled at being sidelined. Nobility, many of whom had endured civil war in their father's time, feared the return of instability. Common folk, weary of upheaval, whispered their concerns in taverns and marketplaces. The crown had overreached, and the kingdom held its breath, sensing that a reckoning was near. Thus, James II, in the confidence of his absolute will, walked into history not as a king of reconciliation, but as the monarch whose reign would ignite the glorious revolution. His quill's strokes upon parchment, bold and unyielding, became the very symbols of the struggle to come. The clash between unchecked prerogative and the rule of law, between one man's vision and a nation's demand for liberty. Yet a king cannot rule in isolation, and the true measure of his reign lay in how his policies were received by the nation he sought to command. The kingdom that James II sought to rule was not one of passive subjects awaiting his word. It was a society alert, restless, and deeply conscious of its own traditions. The majority of the English people, along with the nobility and gentry who form the backbone of Parliament, were loyal to the Church of England. Anglican worship, with its familiar rhythms and its independence from Rome, had become more than a creed. It was an anchor of national identity, a bond that connected crown, country, and community. For these men and women, the prospect of a Catholic king reshaping the fabric of the church was more than unsettling. It stirred an anxiety that cut to the heart of what it meant to be English. Whispers spread quickly in taverns, markets, and manor houses alike. Would England once more find itself under papal influence? Would the hard-won Protestant settlement, secured at such cost through the reigns of Henry, Edward, Elizabeth, and the upheavals of the Civil War, be undone by royal decree? It was not mere theology at stake, but a question of loyalty and future. To change the faith of the realm was, in the eyes of many, to change the realm itself. Beyond questions of religion, there was the matter of law and stability. England's economy in the 1680s was beginning to thrive. Trade expanded through bustling ports like London, Bristol, and Liverpool. Merchants grew prosperous, and artisans supplied goods for a growing middle class. The wool trade, long the lifeblood of the kingdom, was joined by ventures overseas that promised riches from colonies and commerce. This prosperity, fragile but real, depended upon a steady rule of law. Contracts required enforcement, property needed protection, coinage and credit rested on confidence in the future. For townsmen and traders, a monarch who disregarded statutes threatened not only their beliefs but their livelihoods. The rising urban classes, men who read pamphlets and invested in ships, men whose voices had grown stronger in Parliament, wanted more than survival. They desired predictability. They looked for a government that would honor charters, respect contracts, and ensure that justice could not be overturned by royal whim. To them, James's policies seemed less like reform and more like a return to uncertainty, where wealth and freedom could vanish with a stroke of the king's pen. Among the landed gentry, unease deepened as well. These country gentlemen were bound by tradition to defend the Church of England, which had long underpinned their authority in local life. They sat as justices of the peace, presided over parish affairs, and carried responsibility for order in their counties. To see Catholic officers placed in the army or dissenters favored by the crown struck them not only as a betrayal of faith, but as a disruption of the delicate balance of local governance. If the king could ignore the Test Acts and sweep aside statutes, what security remained for their own rights as landowners and guardians of county life? In London, the beating heart of the realm, tension was palpable. Coffeehouses buzzed with talk of royal overreach. Printers and pamphleteers, emboldened by demand, circulated tracts that questioned the king's actions. Though censorship remained a tool of the crown, ideas proved difficult to contain. Rumors, essays, and fiery sermons all pointed to the same conclusion. The people of England feared the slow erosion of their liberties under the guise of indulgence. James's insistence on his prerogatives also alienated members of his own court. Noble families who had long supported the monarchy began to reconsider their loyalty. The peers of the realm, often cautious in speech, grew bold in private correspondence. Many of them had fought or lost relatives in the Civil War. They recognized the signs of a crown pressing too far, of a people being driven toward resistance. For these aristocrats, the issue was not only religion, but the very survival of the constitutional balance they had spent decades attempting to preserve. Even the common folk, less versed in theology or politics, felt the unease. Farmers and villagers spoke of new taxes, strange rumors of soldiers, and the unsettling thought that the king's word alone might change the way they worshipped. In parish churches, clergymen voiced guarded concern, reminding congregations of the sanctity of law and the dangers of arbitrary power. The mood of disquiet filtered down from the halls of Parliament to the humblest pews in rural chapels. Thus, by the late 1680s, English society was a vessel filled with tension. The king's vision collided with the people's fears. To James, his policies represented conscience and authority. To his subjects, they signaled danger and upheaval. The anxiety was not confined to one class or one city. It stretched across the whole of England, from noble estates to merchant houses, from the Inns of Court to the village green. This mounting dissatisfaction created a climate ripe for change. When the Arizal moment came, it would not be only the grandees of Parliament who opposed James, but a society already weary of uncertainty and protective of its liberties. The Bill of Rights, yet to be written, was already foreshadowed in the thoughts and conversations of ordinary men and women. For them, liberty was not an abstract word. It was the promise that faith would not be dictated, that contracts would not be broken, and that the law would stand above the will of any one man. All that remained was a spark, and James himself would provide it. By the late 1680s, the unease that had spread across England needed only a spark to become open resistance. James II determined to assert his royal will, provided that spark himself. In 1687 and again in 1688, he issued the Declaration of Indulgence, proclaiming religious tolerance for Catholics and dissenters alike. On the surface, it seemed a generous gesture, a step toward harmony in a divided land. But to most of his subjects, it was something very different. It was not Parliament that had passed this act. It was the king alone, by virtue of his prerogative. Liberty granted at the pleasure of the monarch, they believed, was liberty that could be withdrawn at the same whim. The Church of England, foundation of the realm's identity, stood at the center of the storm. In May 1688, James commanded that his declaration be read aloud in every parish church across the kingdom. Many clergymen, bound by conscience and loyalty to the established church, hesitated. 7 bishops, among the most respected figures in the nation, resolved to petition the king himself. They asked only that the decree not be forced upon the clergy, arguing that the order was illegal without the consent of Parliament. Their tone was respectful, their request modest, but James saw in it an affront to his authority. The bishops were summoned to trial for seditious libel, the image of 7 men of the cloth, revered for their piety, standing accused before a royal court, sent shockwaves across the country. Crowds followed them as they were taken to the Tower of London, praying and cheering in support. When the trial commenced, the courtroom overflowed with spectators, their eyes fixed not on the judges, but on the bishops, who stood as symbols of a church resisting arbitrary power. After tense deliberation, the verdict was delivered. The bishops were acquitted. The news spread through London in an instant, and the city erupted in celebration. Bells rang out from steeples, bonfires lit the streets, and people embraced as if a great victory had been won. The trial had not been about theology alone. It was about law, about whether the king could command obedience beyond the limits of statute. The acquittal signaled something profound. The nation was willing to defy James openly, and his authority was crumbling. If the trial shook confidence in the king, another event soon shattered it. For years, James's heirs had been uncertain. His daughters, Mary and Anne, were both Protestants, married into Protestant houses. Many assumed that upon James's death, the crown would pass peacefully into Protestant hands, easing the fears of those who dreaded a Catholic dynasty. But in June 1688, Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward. Suddenly, the future looked very different. The birth of a male heir meant the prospect of a lasting Catholic succession. To many, it seemed as if the nightmare they feared had arrived. Not just one Catholic monarch, but a dynasty stretching into the future. Whispers turned into suspicions, and suspicions into rumors. Some even claimed, without proof, that the child had been smuggled into the royal bedchamber in secret. A warming pan carrying an infant presented as the Queen's own. Whether or not the story was believed, it reflected the depth of distrust toward James and his court. The combination of the bishop's trial and the birth of the prince created a political and emotional turning point. The first revealed that the king was willing to prosecute the most respected figures in the church for resisting his will. The second suggested that his policies might extend far beyond his own reign, shaping the destiny of England for generations. In the eyes of nobles, clergy, merchants, and commoners alike, the question was no longer whether James should be opposed, but how. From this moment, the momentum toward revolution became unstoppable. Leading figures of the nobility began to exchange letters in secret, weighing the possibility of inviting William of Orange, husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, to intervene. The trial of the bishops had shown that the law and the people could resist. The birth of the prince convinced many that delay would only entrench the danger. England once again stood on the edge of transformation. The stage was set. A kingdom restless with doubt, a monarch isolated by his own decisions, and a society fearful for its faith and freedom. All these currents converged in 1688. What followed would be called the Glorious Revolution, but its roots lay in these moments: 7 bishops in the dock, a newborn prince in the cradle, and a nation deciding that the future of liberty must be defended. Out of this turmoil came a bold response, one that would reach across the Channel and change the fate of the kingdom. The summer of 1688 found England in a state of watchful tension. The acquittal of the 7 bishops and the birth of a Catholic prince had convinced many that the balance of the kingdom was tipping toward a future they could not accept. In quiet chambers and country estates, conversations grew bold. Nobles, once loyal to the Stuart throne, now weighed the peril of inaction. If they allowed James II to continue unchecked, the liberties of Parliament, the authority of law, and the very identity of Protestant England might vanish into a new Catholic dynasty. It was in this atmosphere that 7 leading figures, earls, lords, and a bishop, took a decisive step. Their names would later be remembered as the Immortal Seven. Bound by a shared conviction that the kingdom's freedoms were in danger, they drafted a letter across the Channel to William of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder, husband to James's Protestant daughter Mary. In the letter, they laid bare the fears of England, the king's abuse of power, his disregard for the church, and the threat posed by the newborn prince. They declared that if William landed with armed support, many in England would rally to his side. William, already a seasoned statesman and soldier, understood the gravity of the invitation. His marriage to Mary gave him a claim of legitimacy, but the greater call was his role as defender of Protestant Europe. Across the continent, the power of Catholic monarchs, led by Louis XIV of France, threatened to dominate. An appeal from England was more than dynastic politics. It was an opportunity to secure the balance of Europe and to preserve liberty in a kingdom whose fate influenced the wider world. In The Hague, William convened his advisors. The risks were immense. To sail against his own father-in-law was to gamble not only with ships and soldiers, but with reputation and destiny. Yet the letter from England gave him assurance. The realm would not resist him as an invader, but would welcome him as a liberator. The prospect of uniting English discontent with Dutch resolve proved irresistible. Plans were set in motion. Autumn winds swept the North Sea as fleets gathered. Sailors rigged masts. Soldiers boarded transports, and cannon were loaded. William's banner bore the motto, "For the Protestant religion and the liberties of England." It was a declaration of intent, a promise that his cause was not conquest, but preservation. Across England, rumors spread of his preparations. The news, carried by merchants and travelers, kindled hope among those who longed for change. In November 1688, the fleet set sail. Storms at first scattered the ships, threatening disaster, but fortune shifted. The winds that might have driven him back turned instead against James's navy, holding the king's fleet in port, while William's armada found passage. On the 5th of November, a date already charged with memory from the failed gunpowder plot, William landed at Torbay on the Devon coast. The scene was one of both caution and anticipation. Villagers and townsfolk watched as Dutch troops, disciplined and orderly, disembarked. Drums beat, standards waved, and proclamations were read aloud declaring William's purpose: to defend the Protestant faith, to restore the laws and liberties of England, and to summon a free parliament. He did not claim the throne, nor did he speak of conquest. His words were carefully chosen to present himself not as an enemy, but as the champion of liberties long cherished. As William advanced inland, support swelled. Nobles who had wavered now declared for him. Officers and soldiers deserted James's army, unwilling to fight against what they saw as the cause of the nation. Even in towns where loyalty to the crown had once run deep, doors opened to William's men. It seemed less an invasion than a procession, as if England itself had been waiting for his arrival. Meanwhile, in Whitehall, James found himself increasingly isolated. Reports of defections reached him daily. His trusted advisors counseled firmness, but the tide was visibly turning. The same kingdom that had once endured civil war to defend or contest its monarchy now seemed united in its rejection of his rule. For James, the landing at Torbay was not merely a military maneuver, it was the unraveling of his authority. From the moment William stepped ashore, the future course of England shifted. The letter of the immortal seven, the winds of fortune, the hopes of a nation weary of absolutism, all converged in that arrival. It was the beginning of the glorious revolution in action, a foreign prince summoned not by ambition alone, but by the call of England's own leaders, welcomed not as conqueror, but as protector. Thus, November 1688 became a chapter etched into the memory of liberty. From Torbay, the path stretched forward toward London, toward Westminster, and toward the great settlement that would redefine the English crown. What had begun as whispered discontent now marched as an army, carrying with it the promise of a kingdom where law would triumph over arbitrary power, and where liberty would be secured, not by hope alone, but by resolve and action. From the moment William's boots touched English soil, the unraveling of James's reign began. James II watched the tide of events turn against him with a mixture of disbelief and dread. From the moment William of Orange stepped ashore at Torbay, the king's grasp on his realm weakened by the day. Reports flowed into Whitehall, noble houses declaring for William, regiments deserting their posts, towns opening gates without resistance. What had been a monarchy fortified by centuries of tradition was unraveling with astonishing speed, and scarcely a sword had been raised. The irony was striking. England, a kingdom that only decades earlier had endured a bloody civil war, now found itself in the midst of a revolution that advanced with scarcely a battle. It was as though the nation itself had chosen its course, refusing to shed blood, but determined to shed its king. James, for all his authority, stood increasingly isolated. His counselors wavered, his generals hesitated, and even members of his own family abandoned him. His daughter Anne slipped away from Whitehall to join William's supporters, declaring she could no longer remain under her father's command. Faced with this collapse, James wavered between defiance and despair. At moments, he vowed to rally his forces, to hold London, to remind the people that he was still their anointed sovereign. But the will to resist faltered each time new defections were announced. The army he sought to rely on melted away, not in combat, but in quiet refusals to fight. In the end, James realized that what he faced was not a foreign invasion in the usual sense, but a withdrawal of loyalty so complete that resistance was futile. In December 1688, James resolved to flee. By leaving, he hoped to preserve his safety and perhaps return with foreign aid to reclaim what he still believed was rightfully his. Under cover of night, he attempted escape down the Thames, casting the great seal of the realm into the river so that Parliament might not use it against him. But fortune turned awkwardly. He was discovered and brought back toward London, a king visibly diminished, more prisoner than sovereign, yet his fate was already sealed. In a second attempt, only days later, James slipped away again, this time successfully. He fled across the Channel to France, where Louis XIV offered him refuge and a court in exile. The flight was both hurried and symbolic, an English king abandoning his own throne without the clash of armies, leaving behind a nation that had effectively rejected his rule without bloodshed. When news of his departure spread, a strange silence settled over London. There was no chaos, no rioting crowds, no violent struggle for control. Instead, a profound sense of vacancy pervaded the kingdom. The throne stood empty, not because a monarch had died, but because he had fled. For the first time in living memory, England faced the reality of a crown without a king. Parliament, gathering in the wake of James's flight, understood the gravity of the moment. The ancient rhythm of monarchy, succession by birth, coronation by tradition, had been interrupted. A king had not been deposed by sword or trial. He had, in effect, abandoned his crown. What remained was the question of legitimacy. Who now would govern, and on what terms? Thus, James's departure, almost bloodless in execution, became one of the most extraordinary events in English history. It marked the end of his reign, the fall of the last attempt at absolute monarchy in England, and the opening act of a constitutional settlement that would shape the future of the realm. The king had fled, the throne was empty, and the stage was set for Parliament to invite William and Mary to rule, not as absolute sovereigns, but as monarchs bound by the law. In the streets of London, the people watched and waited. They had witnessed kings rise and fall before, but never with such little resistance. This time, the nation had changed not by force of arms, but by the force of withdrawal, the quiet yet decisive act of turning away from a ruler who had lost their trust. And so James II departed into exile, his crown left behind, and England prepared to redefine the meaning of monarchy itself. Yet the flight of James was only the beginning. What mattered most was how England chose to interpret the revolution it had just lived through. The flight of James II and the arrival of William and Mary marked more than the end of one reign. It marked the beginning of a new constitutional order. In the months that followed December 1688, the English people, their parliament, and their leaders came to name the moment the Glorious Revolution. It was a phrase chosen carefully, one that conveyed triumph without carnage, transformation without civil war. Unlike the bitter struggles of the 1640s, this was a revolution almost without bloodshed, a change of rulers and principles that unfolded with a striking calm. To many, it seemed that Providence itself had guided events, sparing the nation from the sorrows of past upheavals. But its glory did not lie in peace alone. Its deeper significance was constitutional. For centuries, the crown had been the symbol of supreme authority in England, and monarchs had claimed the right to govern by divine sanction. Parliament, though it had grown in power, was often dismissed, dissolved, or ignored at the king's pleasure. That pattern was broken in 1688. When James fled and Parliament summoned William and Mary, the meaning was clear. Kings might reign, but the authority of government now flowed through Parliament. The monarchy was no longer absolute. It was conditional, dependent on the will and consent of the nation's representatives. The settlement that followed would confirm this truth in law. In 1689, the Bill of Rights formally codified the principles of the Revolution. It declared that the Crown could not suspend laws or levy taxes without parliamentary approval. It affirmed the right to free elections, to free debate in Parliament, and to petition the monarch without fear. It limited the maintenance of standing armies and secured the independence of the judiciary. These were not radical inventions, but deliberate protections drawn from the lessons of past conflict. They turned bitter memory into binding law. To contemporaries, the Glorious Revolution seemed to settle questions that had haunted England for generations. No longer would the kingdom be subject to sudden assertions of divine right or to the whims of a monarch ruling above the law. Instead, governance would rest on a partnership, Crown and Parliament together, with Parliament holding the stronger hand. The revolution did not abolish monarchy, but it redefined it. The sovereign would still wear the crown, open Parliament, and embody the nation, but the power to shape laws and raise revenues would belong to the people's representatives. The change was not only political, but cultural. In coffeehouses, pamphlets, and sermons, people spoke of liberty as something tangible, not merely theoretical. The revolution became a point of pride, a story retold as evidence that England was different from the absolutist kingdoms of Europe. While Louis XIV in France built palaces to magnify royal power, England proclaimed that its glory lay in liberty under law. To many across the Channel, the contrast was stark. Here was a kingdom that had limited its king without descending into anarchy. There were, of course, debates. Some argued that the revolution had been less about liberty than about the ambitions of elites, less a victory for common folk than for the nobility and gentry who wished to secure their own privileges. Yet even if its benefits were uneven, its legacy was undeniable. By setting clear limits on the crown, it created a framework in which the rule of law could expand over time, nurturing freedoms that would later grow into more democratic forms. The term glorious thus carried layers of meaning. It was glorious for its lack of widespread bloodshed. It was glorious for its achievement of balance after decades of turmoil, and it was glorious for the precedent it set. That authority could be transferred not by force of arms alone, but by the consent of the governed and the supremacy of law. The Revolution of 1688 was not merely an English event. It was a signal to the world that power could be restrained, that kings could be bound, and that liberty could be secured through institutions rather than decrees. From the perspective of history, the Glorious Revolution stands as a hinge between eras. Behind it lay the centuries of contested monarchy, rebellion, and restoration. Ahead of it lay the age of constitutional monarchy, parliamentary sovereignty, and the steady rise of a political culture that valued liberty as a national identity. The England that emerged from 1688 was not yet a democracy in the modern sense, but it had set its feet on a path that would lead there. And so, the name endures. Glorious not because it was perfect, nor because it solved every dispute, but because it transformed the foundations of governance without plunging the realm back into chaos. It was a revolution of parchment rather than battlefield, of oaths and statutes rather than armies and sieges. Its legacy was a promise that law would outlast whim, that Parliament would outlast prerogative, and that the liberties of England would be safeguarded by more than hope. They would be safeguarded by history itself. Yet triumph alone did not suffice. The kingdom now faced the pressing question of how to rebuild its monarchy. When James II fled across the Channel in December 1688, he left more than an empty palace behind. He left a constitutional void. For centuries, England had been bound by the assumption that the crown passed from sovereign to heir by right of birth and divine sanction. Now, for the first time, the throne was unoccupied not because of death or conquest, but because the reigning king had abandoned it. Into this silence stepped Parliament, summoned in January 1689 to confront the extraordinary question, how could a kingdom govern itself without a king? This gathering would later be called the Convention Parliament, and its task was nothing less than to redefine monarchy itself. The air inside Westminster was charged with urgency. The Commons filled with members drawn from boroughs and counties, many carrying with them the grievances of their constituents. The Lords took their seats, peers whose families had stood in the chambers for centuries. Together, they faced the dilemma of legitimacy. The debates were heated, and the issue was simple in words, yet profound in meaning. Had James been deposed, or had he deposed himself? To depose a king was to admit Parliament's power to unseat a monarch, an act revolutionary in spirit, perhaps too bold for many. To say James had abdicated by fleeing suggested that he had abandoned his duties and, by absence, surrendered his throne. The choice of language mattered, for it defined the principle. Was sovereignty a trust that could be forfeited or an inheritance that only death could end? Arguments filled the chamber. Some members insisted that Parliament must declare James removed, a tyrant unfit to rule. Others recoiled, fearing such language would set a dangerous precedent. If Parliament could depose one king, might it depose any? The more cautious preferred to frame the matter differently. James, they said, had broken the contract of kingship by fleeing and casting away the Great Seal. By this act, he had effectively abdicated, leaving the throne vacant. Parliament, therefore, was not seizing power, but merely recognizing reality. Behind these debates lay deeper fears. No one wished to plunge the kingdom back into the chaos of the 1640s, when Charles I's trial and execution had led to civil war and experiment with republican rule. The memory of that turmoil weighed heavily. Men who had lived through those years counseled restraint. England did not want another collapse of monarchy. It wanted stability, but stability under law. At the same time, urgency pressed them forward. A kingdom without a monarch could not endure. Laws required enforcement. Armies required command. Foreign policy required authority. Every day without settlement risked disorder. And so the Convention Parliament wrestled not only with words, but with the very survival of governance. It was agreed that the throne must not remain empty. The next step was to determine who should fill it. Some voices called for Mary, James's eldest daughter, whose Protestant faith and marriage to William of Orange gave her strong claim. Others argued that William himself, already proven in leadership and welcomed as England's defender, should reign alongside her. In the end, compromise prevailed. They would rule together, William and Mary, not as conquerors, but as sovereigns chosen with the consent of Parliament. The decision carried immense weight. By declaring that James had abdicated, and by offering the crown conditionally to William and Mary, Parliament affirmed a new principle, that monarchy existed not in isolation, but within the framework of law and consent. It was an act both careful and revolutionary. Careful because it avoided the appearance of direct deposition. Revolutionary because it placed in Parliament's hands the authority to define kingship itself. The atmosphere in Westminster was tense, but resolute. Members knew they were not simply settling a succession, but writing precedent. From the galleries, observers watched history unfold. The arguments were steeped in legal reasoning. Yet beneath the words lay a powerful truth. The crown no longer stood above the nation, but within it. Thus, in February 1689, the Convention Parliament declared the throne vacant and offered it jointly to William and Mary. The act filled the void left by James's flight, but it did more. It set the stage for a constitutional monarchy in which kings and queens would reign under the law, not above it. Cinematically, one might picture the moment. Parchment laid upon a table, pens poised, peers and members leaning forward as the words were read aloud. Outside, Londoners gathered to hear the news, their breath forming clouds in the winter air. Inside, the decision was sealed. The old order had ended not with the clash of armies, but with the power of deliberation and consent. The Convention Parliament had answered the question that James's flight had posed. Sovereignty would not vanish into exile with him. It would be reclaimed, reshaped, and restored, not to a single monarch's will, but to a partnership of crown and parliament, balanced within the framework of liberty. Yet declaring the throne vacant was only the first step. The greater task lay in defining the terms on which it would be filled. William and Mary did not step into power as conquerors seizing a crown by force, but as rulers summoned by Parliament under unprecedented conditions. In February 1689, after weeks of deliberation, the Convention Parliament resolved that James II had abandoned the throne and that the crown should pass not by inheritance alone, but by choice. Yet this choice would not be unconditional. Before William and Mary could be proclaimed king and queen, they were required to accept a new charter of governance, the Declaration of Rights. This declaration was more than a formality. It was the written essence of the glorious revolution, the foundation on which the new monarchy would rest. In solemn articles, it declared that the king could not suspend or dispense with laws without parliamentary consent, that taxation required approval, that subjects had the right to petition, that free elections must be preserved, and that freedom of speech within Parliament was to be inviolate. It also forbade the maintenance of standing armies in peacetime without parliamentary sanction, and reaffirmed the independence of the courts. In every clause, the document spoke not of privilege granted from the throne, but of liberties secured against it. William, pragmatic and cautious, understood the weight of the moment. He had crossed the Channel not merely to defend Protestantism, but to safeguard a kingdom's liberty. To accept the crown on these terms was to acknowledge that he would reign as a constitutional monarch, bound by law, limited in authority, and answerable to Parliament. Some of his advisers hesitated, warning that the precedent would weaken royal power forever. But William knew that the crown could not be sustained in any other way. To refuse would be to risk the collapse of support that had carried him to London. To accept was to solidify his rule and secure the future of England on a stable foundation. Mary's position was equally significant. As James's daughter, she carried hereditary legitimacy, yet she was willing to share sovereignty with her husband, recognizing that the union of their claims, her bloodline and his leadership, offered the best path for the nation. Together, they accepted the Declaration of Rights, setting their reign upon a contract not of divine prerogative, but of law and mutual consent. The scene, as remembered in chronicles, carried the gravitas of a turning point. In Westminster, under the gaze of peers and members of Parliament, William and Mary stood not as figures of unchecked majesty, but as monarchs whose power had been deliberately bounded. The parchment was read aloud, its clauses echoing through the chamber. When they signified their acceptance, a murmur of approval filled the hall. The crown would endure, but transformed. No longer the embodiment of absolute rule, it became a symbol of government by law. Cinematically, one might imagine the moment as a tableau. William and Mary before the assembled Parliament, the Declaration of Rights unfurled before them. The words, sharp and deliberate, hung in the air, a reminder that authority henceforth was shared, constrained, and defined by statute. The monarchy itself seemed to bow, not in humiliation, but in recognition of a new order. Outside, Londoners gathered in anticipation. Bells pealed, bonfires flared, and the city celebrated not simply the accession of new sovereigns, but the birth of a constitutional settlement. For ordinary men and women, the acceptance of the Declaration of Rights promised stability and protection. It meant that grievances would have channels in law, not only in rebellion. It meant that liberty, long fought for and often fragile, now had written guarantees. For Parliament, it was a vindication of centuries of struggle, from Magna Carta to the Petition of Right, from the Civil War to the flight of James II. At last, the principle was established. Kings and queens might sit on the throne, but they would do so as guardians of liberties, not as masters above them. Thus, the joint coronation of William and Mary in April 1689 carried a meaning deeper than ceremony. It was not merely the placing of crowns upon heads, but the placing of limits upon crowns themselves. The Declaration of Rights, soon to be enacted as the Bill of Rights, ensured that the monarchy would survive only by yielding to law. The image endures, two monarchs standing before their parliament, accepting not only a throne, but a contract. In that gesture lay the essence of the glorious revolution, the transformation of monarchy from absolute authority into constitutional rule, and the birth of a system that would guide England into the modern age. Yet acceptance alone was not enough. The promises written in the Declaration still needed to be secured in law. In the spring of 1689, after William and Mary had accepted the Declaration of Rights and the crown that Parliament offered, the document itself was refined and enacted as law. Thus was born the Bill of Rights, 1689, a statute that would come to define not only the reign of William and Mary, but the entire trajectory of the English Constitution. To understand its place in history, one must see it not merely as a legal record, but as a script written from centuries of conflict, trial, and compromise. Each clause bore the weight of bitter experience. Each provision spoke to the struggles that had shaken the kingdom since Magna Carta, and together they formed a charter of liberty that was both practical and profound. The heart of the bill lay in the restraint of royal power. For too long, monarchs had claimed the right to govern by decree, suspending laws at will, dispensing with statutes when they proved inconvenient, or raising revenue without parliamentary consent. Charles I had levied forced loans and ship money. Charles II had ruled without parliament for long stretches. James II had suspended the Test Acts to favor his allies. Such actions had fueled rebellion and distrust. The Bill of Rights now declared unequivocally that the Crown could not suspend laws or levy taxes without the approval of Parliament. No royal proclamation could overturn statute. No king or queen could demand money from the people unless it had been granted by their representatives. In one stroke, the financial and legal independence of the monarchy was curtailed, and the authority of Parliament secured. Equally significant was the bill's affirmation of political liberty within Parliament itself. The right to free elections was enshrined, ensuring that members of the Commons could not be hand-picked or coerced by the Crown. Once elected, they were guaranteed freedom of speech and debate within Parliament, immune from prosecution or royal reprisal. This principle, parliamentary privilege, was more than procedural. It was a safeguard of truth, enabling representatives to speak openly of the kingdom's needs, its grievances, and its hopes without fear of punishment. The floor of the Commons became a space where the nation's voice could be heard without interference. The bill also spoke to the question of military power. Under the Stuarts, the maintenance of standing armies in peacetime had stirred suspicion. Soldiers quartered in towns, loyal more to the crown than to the law, seemed a threat to the liberties of Englishmen. The Bill of Rights forbade the keeping of a standing army during peace, without the explicit consent of Parliament. In this way, the sword was placed firmly under the watch of the people's representatives. The principle echoed far beyond its moment, influencing later generations to see civilian control of the military as an essential safeguard of liberty. Beyond these central provisions, the Bill of Rights articulated a series of protections for ordinary subjects. It affirmed the right of individuals to petition the crown without fear of retribution, establishing a lawful means of expressing grievances. It outlawed excessive fines and cruel or unusual punishments, ensuring that justice would not be an instrument of royal vengeance. It guaranteed that trials would be fair and that juries would be protected from intimidation. In all these clauses, the emphasis was not on abstract philosophy, but on the lived experience of a nation that had suffered from arbitrary power. The scope of the bill was vast in implication, yet measured in tone. It did not abolish monarchy, nor did it seek to rewrite society from the ground up. Instead, it codified what the people of England had come to believe, that liberty and law must stand above prerogative, that Parliament was the guardian of the nation's will, and that the rights of subjects could no longer be brushed aside by the stroke of a royal pen. It was a settlement born of pragmatism as much as of principle, designed to prevent the abuses of the past and to anchor the kingdom in stability for the future. Cinematically, one might imagine the moment of enactment as a tableau of parchment and resolve. In the Chamber of Westminster, clerks read the clauses aloud while peers and members nodded in assent. Outside, Londoners crowded the streets, their chatter filled with both relief and anticipation. The bill was not dramatic in its language, yet the very simplicity of its words gave them power. They promised a government of law rather than of men, a monarchy that reigned but did not rule unchecked, and a parliament that spoke with the voice of the nation. The Bill of Rights also carried symbolic resonance that extended far beyond the island. In Europe, where absolute monarchs like Louis XIV in France reigned with unquestioned authority, England's act stood as a contrast. Here was a kingdom that had chosen to bind its sovereigns, to transform rebellion into settlement, and to elevate liberty into law. The world took notice. Philosophers, statesmen, and reformers abroad looked to England as an example that power could be tamed without anarchy, that stability could be preserved without despotism. Yet within England itself, the bill's importance was perhaps most keenly felt in its quiet assurances. For the merchant counting his coins in London, it meant confidence that taxes would not be arbitrarily imposed. For the farmer in his village, it meant assurance that justice would not bend to the whims of a local officer serving the king's command. For the clergyman in his pulpit, it meant that faith and conscience would not be dictated by proclamation. For parliamentarians, it meant that their voice was no longer a courtesy, but a necessity of governance. It is worth reflecting on the word rights. In 1689, this did not yet mean universal equality or democracy as later generations would imagine. It meant the protection of established liberties, the securing of ancient customs, and the defense of subjects against arbitrary power. But the resonance of the term was profound. To write rights into law was to make them enduring, not gifts to be granted and withdrawn, but foundations upon which future liberties could be built. Over time, the Bill of Rights would be seen as a cornerstone of constitutional government. Its influence would cross the Atlantic, shaping the thought of American colonists, who, nearly a century later, would craft their own declarations of rights. Its language would echo in debates on liberty in Europe and beyond. It became not just a statute of England, but a beacon of what constitutional liberty could mean for the world. In the immediate years after 1689, however, its impact was simpler. It brought stability. With William and Mary on the throne, bound by oath and law, the kingdom found balance after decades of turmoil. The revolution was complete, not with a battlefield victory, but with a parchment that preserved both monarchy and liberty. The Bill of Rights ensured that the mistakes of James II would not be repeated, that Parliament's authority would be secure, and that subjects would have protections against tyranny. Cinematically, one could see the contrast, the deserted throne of James II, empty and abandoned, giving way to the crowned figures of William and Mary, standing not above their people but before them, bound by the document spread out in ink. It was the triumph of law over caprice, of liberty over absolutism, of settlement over strife. Thus, the Bill of Rights of 1689 stands in history not merely as a law, but as a covenant. It was an agreement between ruler and ruled, forged from the trials of centuries, and sealed not in blood, but in reason. Its clauses may appear simple, yet they carried the promise of a nation's future. And though England of 1689 could not yet imagine all the liberties that would follow, it had set a course. From that year forward, the crown would reign, Parliament would govern, and the rights of the people would be written into the very fabric of the kingdom's law. With the ink of the Bill of Rights still fresh, England now faced the task of living under the new order it had created. The coronation of William and Mary in 1689 did not merely signal a change of rulers. It marked the dawn of a new form of monarchy. For centuries, kings and queens of England had stood as the supreme arbiters of the realm, wielding authority that seemed to flow directly from heaven. Now, after the Glorious Revolution and the passing of the Bill of Rights, a subtle but profound transformation had taken place. The crown remained, the ceremonies endured, the majesty of monarchy was preserved, but the essence of power had shifted. From this moment forward, the sovereign would reign, but not rule in the absolute sense. William and Mary, and the monarchs who followed them, sat upon the throne not as masters above the law, but as partners within a constitutional order. Decisions of taxation, declarations of war, the passage of statutes, these no longer rested solely in the will of a king or queen. They were anchored in Parliament, debated by elected representatives, and sanctioned by the voice of the nation. The balance of power had moved decisively. The monarch became the symbol of unity, while Parliament became the engine of governance. The Convention Parliament of 1689 had made its intention plain. Authority was not to vanish with James II into exile. It was to be reclaimed and reshaped. In this settlement, Parliament emerged as the true center of political life. Its chambers, once dependent on royal summons and vulnerable to dissolution at the monarch's pleasure, now stood with new permanence and dignity. Elections became the pulse of legitimacy. Statutes, once subject to suspension by royal decree, now held firm against such interference. Sovereignty itself had shifted location, no longer concentrated in the person of the king, but distributed among the representatives of the people. William himself accepted this arrangement with calculated realism. He was a soldier and statesman, more concerned with the defense of Europe against Louis XIV than with clinging to the prerogatives of Stuart kingship. He needed Parliament's support for funds, for armies, for alliances abroad. By accepting the constitutional limits set upon him, he secured the stability of his throne and the resources of the realm. Mary, with her hereditary claim and Protestant faith, lent the arrangement legitimacy. Together, they embodied a monarchy transformed, a monarchy constitutional, bound by contract and law. Cinematically, one might picture the contrast between past and present. Under Charles I, the monarch had dissolved Parliament at will, ruling from Whitehall with decrees that sparked rebellion. Under James II, royal edicts had filled the land with suspicion and fear. Now in the reign of William and Mary, the center of drama shifted. It was the House of Commons that rang with argument, the lords who shaped consensus, the ministers who rose and fell according to parliamentary confidence. The stage of power had moved from the royal court to the floor of Westminster. This shift did not mean the monarchy was irrelevant. On the contrary, the king and queen remained the figures through whom the state was personified. They opened sessions of Parliament, commanded loyalty and oaths, and served as visible symbols of unity. But their role was altered. They were guardians, not masters, servants of the Constitution, not its source. Their authority derived from law and their legitimacy from consent. In this way, monarchy was preserved not by resisting change, but by embracing it. For the people of England, the difference was felt most clearly in the rhythms of daily governance. Taxes were debated, not imposed. Laws were passed in the open, not declared in secrecy. Armies marched with Parliament's sanction, not at the whim of the sovereign. Even the humble right to petition, once fraught with risk, became a lawful expression of grievance. These were not mere abstractions. They shaped the trust of the governed, binding subject and state together under a common framework. Historians would later look upon 1689 as the true birth of constitutional monarchy. Magna Carta had planted the seed, the Petition of Right had watered it, the Civil War had tested it in fire, but it was the Revolution settlement that made it bloom. The principle that the monarch reigned but did not rule, ceremonial yet limited, crowned yet constrained, became the defining feature of English governance. The significance of this transformation reached beyond England. Across Europe, rulers still clung to absolutism, building palaces and armies to magnify their will. England, by contrast, presented a different spectacle, a monarchy humbled yet enduring, a parliament elevated yet restrained by law. It was a balance that promised both liberty and order, both tradition and change. In time, it would become a model emulated by others, an inspiration for nations that sought to reconcile authority with freedom. Thus, the rise of constitutional monarchy was not the end of kingship, but its reinvention. By yielding power, the crown preserved its dignity. By sharing authority, it ensured its survival. William and Mary, stepping into this new role, embodied the paradox of monarchy after 1689, that to endure, it must consent to limits, that to reign gloriously, it must rule constitutionally. What had begun as a settlement of crowns soon became a settlement of classes, altering the fortunes of nobles, merchants, and commoners alike. The settlement of 1689 not only reshaped the throne, but recalibrated the balance of power across English society. In the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution, it became evident that the revolution was not merely about kings and parliaments, but also about the fortunes of those who lived beneath their authority. The constitutional framework that emerged offered new securities to some, new opportunities to others, and redefined the very nature of authority in the realm. For the nobility and the landed gentry, the changes were profound and largely favorable. These were the families who held vast estates, who served as justices of the peace, and who filled the benches of Parliament. By ensuring that taxation and lawmaking could not proceed without parliamentary sanction, the Revolution placed extraordinary weight upon their shoulders. They had always wielded influence in their counties, but now their role within the machinery of state was formally elevated. No monarch could bypass them. No law could be enforced without their consent. The landed elite, bound together by property, lineage, and local authority, became the indispensable partners of governance. In their halls and manors, they knew that the liberties enshrined in the Bill of Rights were as much a safeguard of their estates as of the Constitution itself. Cinematically, one might imagine the quiet pride of these men as they returned to their country seats after the Revolution settlement. They were no longer merely subjects of a crown, they were guardians of a new order. Their voices in Westminster carried greater weight than ever before, and their grip on local justice gave them influence at both ends of the kingdom's hierarchy. The crown had been humbled, and in that humbling, the aristocracy had risen. Yet the Revolution also extended protections beyond the manor and into the marketplace. England's merchants, shopkeepers, and artisans, those whose wealth derived not from inherited land, but from trade and enterprise, found in the new settlement a promise of stability. The Bill of Rights guaranteed that contracts would be secure, that taxes would not be levied without parliamentary approval, and that commerce would no longer be subject to the unpredictable whim of royal proclamation. For a society increasingly driven by trade, these assurances were vital. Ships could sail, goods could be exchanged, and credit could be extended with greater confidence than ever before. The bustling city of London, already the beating heart of English commerce, now thrived under this protection. Coffee houses buzzed with the talk of ventures and investment schemes. Pamphlets spread news of trade abroad, and merchants debated in safety the prospects of colonial markets. They knew that while Parliament might regulate or tax, it would do so through public debate and legislation, not secret decrees. The Revolution had turned economic uncertainty into a more predictable order, one where prosperity could grow in the light of law. For urban citizens, the principle of parliamentary supremacy meant more than distant debates in Westminster. It meant that their grievances had a channel, that their voices, though indirect, could reach the ears of those who governed. The right to petition affirmed in the Bill of Rights became not just a formality, but a means of accountability. Townsmen who might once have feared royal retaliation for criticism could now address their government with lawful confidence. Even those without the vote sensed the shift. They were not enfranchised in the modern sense, but they lived in a kingdom where the law was visibly stronger than the king. The ripple effects extended still further. Religious dissenters, long persecuted, found greater tolerance under the new order, though not yet equality. Protestant nonconformists benefited from William's own sympathies and from the political necessity of coalition. Catholics remained distrusted and their liberties restricted, but the broader principle had been set. Conscience was not to be dictated solely from the throne. The revolution, imperfect though it was, had opened a space for religious plurality within a framework of law. Still, it must be said, the benefits of the new balance were not shared equally. The poor, the landless, the laborers of field and workshop saw little direct change in their daily struggles. For them, liberty remained a concept observed from afar, embodied in the debates of gentlemen and the statutes of Parliament. Yet even here, there was a subtle shift. By restraining arbitrary power, the settlement created a more stable society in which common people could live with fewer fears of sudden upheaval. Security of law, even if imperfectly applied, was preferable to the shadow of unchecked monarchy. Historians have often remarked that the Glorious Revolution was less a revolution of the masses than a revolution of the elite. There is truth in this. It was the nobility and gentry who gained the most direct influence, the merchants and urban classes who reaped the clearest rewards, but within these gains lay the seeds of future change. The precedent of rights declared, of liberties affirmed, of governance tied to consent, created an environment in which broader demands for participation could one day grow. The revolution did not complete the journey toward democracy, but it bent the path in that direction. The balance of power in 1689 thus reflected the realities of its time. A society still hierarchical, still unequal, but now anchored in law rather than whim. The nobles found their privileges secured, the gentry their authority enhanced, the merchants their enterprises protected, and the citizens their petitions dignified. The monarchy endured, but Parliament governed. The Revolution settlement had redrawn the lines of English power, not by erasing them, but by fixing them more firmly in the soil of constitutional liberty. In this new order, England discovered a paradoxical truth. By strengthening Parliament, it had preserved the monarchy. By elevating the rights of the few, it had planted the principles that would one day extend to the many. The Glorious Revolution was not a final act, but a chapter that ensured the crown would shine still, but only in the light of law, and that society, though divided by class, would rest more securely under the promise of constitutional government. Yet even as the Revolution settlement secured liberties and stability, it also exposed the tensions and contradictions that still lay beneath the surface of English society. Even as the Revolution settlement promised stability and enshrined liberty in law, England's new order carried with it challenges and tensions that could not be ignored. The balance of power had shifted, but it had not eliminated division. The crown was humbled, Parliament was ascendant, yet the settlement left unresolved questions that would echo through the years. The monarchy endured, but its role was no longer clear in every respect. William and Mary reigned as partners with Parliament, but the practical boundaries of their authority were constantly tested. What decisions belonged to the sovereign and what decisions must be left to the commons? In moments of foreign war or domestic crisis, the temptation for the monarch to reassert old prerogatives still lingered. The constitutional monarchy was strong in principle but delicate in practice, and the settlement of 1689 required constant vigilance to uphold. Parliament itself, though elevated, was hardly a body of universal representation. The Commons were elected by a narrow electorate, restricted to property holders in boroughs whose votes were often controlled by local elites. The great mass of England's population, the landless, the laborers, the poor, had no voice in the system that now claimed to embody the nation's will. While liberty had been secured for those who governed, it remained distant for those who tilled the soil or worked the shops of London and provincial towns. The Revolution had preserved the structures of hierarchy, even as it constrained the crown. Religious questions also remained unsettled. The settlement had been born of fear of Catholic absolutism, and Catholics continued to suffer under civil disabilities. They could not sit in Parliament, could not hold public office, and remained objects of suspicion. Protestant dissenters fared somewhat better, but even they were not fully embraced within the national church. Tolerance had widened, but it was limited, and the dream of a truly comprehensive liberty of conscience was still deferred. England had gained stability, but it had not yet found inclusivity. Economic life, though buoyed by the protections of law, faced its own contradictions. Merchants in London and rising towns prospered under the safeguards of predictable taxation and secure contracts, but the burden of taxation still fell heavily on the poor. The new order encouraged commerce and credit, yet for many in rural England, daily life changed little. The revolution created confidence for investors and security for landowners, but the benefits did not flow evenly to those who lived at the margins of subsistence. There was also the looming question of empire. With Parliament strengthened and commerce protected, England's ambitions abroad began to grow. Colonies in the Americas and trade in Asia became ever more central to the national economy. Yet the liberties secured at home did not always extend overseas. For colonists, merchants, and indigenous peoples in distant lands, the Revolution was felt less as a charter of liberty than as a consolidation of English power. The contradiction between constitutional freedom at home and imperial domination abroad would grow sharper in the century to come. The settlement itself was a compromise, and compromises carry fragility. The nobility and gentry embraced their enhanced role, but their dominance could foster resentment. The merchants welcomed legal protections, yet their influence threatened to challenge older hierarchies. Parliament was now the central pillar of governance, but it too could err, could overreach, could become an instrument of faction rather than of balance. The Revolution had replaced one kind of arbitrary power with a system designed to prevent it, but the human flaws of ambition, rivalry, and inequality remained. If one were to picture the England of the 1690s, it would not be a land entirely at peace with itself. In the countryside, villagers gathered in taverns to debate news from London, many only dimly aware of the legal transformations that had taken place. In the towns, merchants and artisans pursued prosperity under the shelter of Parliament's authority, but anxieties about war and taxation still weighed heavily. At Westminster, the Commons and the Lords argued fiercely, their debates filled with conviction, but also with self-interest. The Revolution had tamed the monarchy, but it had not silenced the struggles of politics. And yet, these very challenges were part of the settlement's legacy. By binding the crown and empowering Parliament, the Revolution ensured that conflicts would be fought in words and statutes rather than in civil war. By narrowing the franchise, it planted the seed of future demands for inclusion. By limiting the monarchy, it left space for society itself to grow into the structures of government. The Revolution was not a conclusion, but a beginning, a framework in which liberty and law could be contested, expanded, and redefined across generations. The story of 1689 was therefore not one of perfection achieved, but of possibility secured. The Glorious Revolution had curbed the abuses of kings, elevated the authority of Parliament, and promised protections for subjects. But it also revealed the unfinished work of liberty, the exclusion of the many, the persistence of inequality, the limits of tolerance. The settlement of 1689 was a promise written in ink, but it was a promise that required time, struggle, and imagination to fulfill. To grasp why the settlement of 1689 mattered so profoundly, it must be placed within a longer tradition, a chain of charters and statutes through which the English people had, across centuries, sought to bind kings within the rule of law. The Bill of Rights of 1689 did not stand alone. It was part of a longer chain, a story centuries in the making, in which the people of England sought to bind the power of kings within the confines of law. To understand its weight, one must place it alongside earlier milestones, Magna Carta of 1215, the Petition of Right of 1628, and the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679. Each emerged from crisis, each carved a limit upon royal power, and together they formed a sequence that defined the English constitutional tradition. Magna Carta was the first great assertion. In the fields of Runnymede, the barons compelled King John to accept that his authority was not boundless. The charter spoke of liberties, of the promise that no free man could be imprisoned without lawful judgment, that justice could not be sold or delayed. Though it was originally a bargain between king and barons, its spirit endured far beyond its immediate context. It established the radical idea that even the monarch was subject to law and that his will could not override the rights of his subjects. Centuries later, the Petition of Right carried that principle into the stormy reign of Charles I. By then, Parliament had grown more assertive, demanding that the king recognize its control over taxation and its role in safeguarding liberties. The petition declared that no loans could be forced without consent, no subjects imprisoned without cause, and no soldiers quartered upon citizens against their will. It was a direct response to abuses of power, a reminder that the king ruled not by unbounded prerogative, but in partnership with the laws of the land. The defiance of Charles and his refusal to honor the petition contributed to the Civil War that would eventually cost him his throne and his life. In the Restoration era, as monarchy was revived under Charles II, the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679 emerged as another vital safeguard. It enshrined the right of prisoners to challenge unlawful detention, ensuring that no subject could be held at the monarch's pleasure without cause. It gave teeth to the promise of Magna Carta and substance to the demands of the Petition of Right. It was, in essence, a bulwark against tyranny, guaranteeing that liberty could not be quietly eroded by imprisonment in the Tower or the command of royal officers. The Bill of Rights of 1689 completed this sequence. Where Magna Carta had planted the principle, the Petition of Right had demanded adherence, and habeas corpus had secured protection. The Bill of Rights tied them all into a coherent settlement. It declared that sovereignty rested not in the unfettered will of the monarch, but in a framework of law, parliament, and the rights of subjects. It addressed directly the abuses of James II and ensured that they could not be repeated. Suspension of laws, arbitrary taxation, intimidation of parliament, these were forbidden forever. The liberties of the people, though not universal in scope, were written into statute. Seen together, these documents reveal a story not of sudden upheaval, but of gradual construction. England's constitution was not born in a single moment, but layered across generations. Each crisis produced its charter, each struggle its safeguard. The narrative was neither simple nor smooth. There were reversals, rebellions, and years of turmoil, but the direction was clear. The trajectory bent steadily away from absolutism and toward the supremacy of law. This heritage became a source of immense pride. English statesmen and pamphleteers in the 18th century spoke of their constitution as a model of balance. A monarchy preserved but restrained, a parliament empowered but bound by tradition, liberties secured not by rhetoric alone, but by written guarantees. The Bill of Rights was often mentioned in the same breath as Magna Carta, a modern counterpart to that ancient parchment. Together, they stood as symbols of continuity and progress, the anchors of a national identity built around liberty. The influence of this tradition was not confined to England's shores. Across Europe, thinkers and reformers took note of a kingdom where monarchs were limited, where laws prevailed over whim, and where liberties were enshrined in writing. Across the Atlantic, colonists in America would cite these very documents: Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, Habeas Corpus, and the Bill of Rights, as precedents for their own claims to freedom. The language of English liberty became a universal language, shaping ideas of governance far beyond its original home. In daily life, the effect was more subtle, but no less real. A merchant signing a contract, a farmer challenging an unjust levy, a clergyman preaching without fear of sudden royal censure, all could take comfort in the fact that law now stood as their protection. These were not perfect safeguards, nor did they apply equally to all, but they created a culture of expectation. Liberty was not an abstract word. It was something felt in courts, in markets, in parishes, and in Parliament itself. Thus, the Bill of Rights of 1689 was both a culmination and a foundation. It drew together centuries of effort to restrain royal power, and it provided the platform from which future generations would press for broader freedoms. In its clauses, one hears the echo of Magna Carta's barons, the voices of parliamentarians confronting Charles I, the pleas of prisoners protected by habeas corpus. In its legacy, one sees the seed of modern constitutional government, planted deep in English soil, destined to grow across the world. Yet the influence of this constitutional heritage did not stop at England's shores. It crossed oceans, carried by colonists who claimed these liberties as their own. Across the Atlantic, in the scattered towns and settlements of England's colonies in North America, the Bill of Rights of 1689 resonated with unusual force. These were communities that saw themselves as English in culture and law, bound to the mother country, not only by allegiance to the crown, but by an expectation of liberties long cherished at home. For colonists in Boston, Philadelphia, and Williamsburg, the principles of the Glorious Revolution were not distant abstractions. They were part of the inheritance they believed was theirs by right. From the earliest days, English colonists carried with them the language of Magna Carta, the assurances of the Petition of Right, and the protections of habeas corpus. But the Bill of Rights gave these ideals a contemporary authority, a living statute that defined the conditions of monarchy itself. When colonists spoke of their rights as Englishmen, it was to these documents they pointed. They believed, as did their counterparts in London, that rulers must govern with the consent of the governed, that taxation required representation, and that liberty was guaranteed not by the benevolence of rulers, but by the framework of law. Throughout the 18th century, these convictions grew stronger. Colonial assemblies modeled themselves on Parliament, passing local laws, raising revenues, and defending what they saw as their constitutional privileges. When royal governors attempted to override their decisions, the colonists invoked the Bill of Rights as a shield. The right to petition, the protection against arbitrary taxation, the insistence on free debate. These were principles the colonists claimed not as gifts, but as guarantees embedded in their English heritage. As tensions with Britain deepened after 1763, the memory of the Glorious Revolution became a rallying point. When Parliament in London imposed taxes without colonial consent, the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, colonists declared such measures a violation of the very rights secured in 1689. Pamphlets and sermons echoed with appeals to the Bill of Rights, arguing that England had already declared that taxation without representation was illegal, that standing armies without parliamentary approval were dangerous, and that liberty must be preserved against arbitrary rule. The Revolution settlement of the 17th century became the rhetoric of protest in the 18th. The influence reached its climax in the American Revolution itself. When the colonies declared independence in 1776, they justified their cause not only with Enlightenment philosophy, but with the precedents of English constitutional history. Thomas Jefferson and his contemporaries were steeped in the language of rights, and they drew freely upon the tradition that stretched from Magna Carta through the Bill of Rights of 1689. The idea that government was a contract, that rulers could forfeit their authority by violating liberties, and that law stood above kings. All these were legacies of England's constitutional struggle, yet the story did not end with independence. In drafting their own constitution, the framers of the United States faced the challenge of defining rights in a republic rather than a monarchy. Here, too, the English Bill of Rights served as a guide. In 1791, when the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution were ratified as the American Bill of Rights, the echoes were unmistakable. The prohibition of excessive bail, the guarantee of trial by jury, the protection against cruel and unusual punishments, these provisions were directly lifted from the 1689 model. The insistence on free speech, on the right to petition, on limits to governmental power, all bore the imprint of English precedent, adapted to the new circumstances of a republic. The connection was acknowledged openly at the time. American leaders spoke of their Bill of Rights as part of a lineage, a continuation of struggles that had begun in England centuries earlier. They saw themselves not as inventors of liberty, but as heirs to a tradition they believed had been betrayed by the policies of George III in Parliament. By enshrining these rights in their own constitution, they claimed both continuity with English history and a new independence from its monarchy. The transatlantic legacy was thus twofold. For England, the Bill of Rights had secured constitutional monarchy. For America, it provided the framework for a republic founded on written guarantees of liberty. In both cases, the central principle was the same, that rulers were bound by law, that rights were not favors but protections, and that the people could demand accountability from those who govern them. By the end of the 18th century, the Bill of Rights of 1689 had become more than a statute of English law. It was a seed carried across oceans, planted in new soil, and made to grow in different forms. In America, it blossomed into a constitutional guarantee that shaped the identity of a new nation. In doing so, it confirmed the enduring truth that the legacy of liberty is not confined by geography, but travels wherever people seek to defend their rights. Yet while the Bill of Rights inspired new experiments in liberty across the Atlantic, its most immediate significance was felt in Europe, where England's constitutional monarchy stood in stark contrast to the absolutism of France. In the closing years of the 17th century, Europe presented a striking contrast between two competing visions of monarchy. On one side of the Channel stood France, under the rule of Louis XIV, the Sun King, who embodied the very essence of absolutism. On the other side stood England, reshaped by the Glorious Revolution, where the Bill of Rights had forged a monarchy bound by law and tempered by Parliament. These two paths, one of unrestrained royal authority, the other of constitutional liberty, offered Europe a study in divergence that would shape its political destiny for centuries to come. Louis XIV's France represented the triumph of centralized monarchy. At Versailles, the king constructed not only a palace of unprecedented magnificence, but also a stage upon which the drama of absolutism was performed daily. Nobles who might once have wielded independent power were drawn into the orbit of the crown, their influence diminished by dependence on royal favor. Taxes were imposed, and armies raised without the consent of representative institutions. The king's word was law, and his authority, claimed by divine right, was unquestionable. In this vision of governance, stability came through the concentration of power, liberty through obedience to the sovereign's will. England, by contrast, had chosen another path. The events of 1688 and the Bill of Rights of 1689 created a system where Parliament stood as the central institution of governance, where law limited the crown, and where liberty was secured not by royal benevolence but by enforceable rights. The English monarchy retained its dignity, but its reach was curtailed. Unlike France, where the monarch embodied the state, in England the monarch became a partner within a framework of shared authority. This was not the eradication of monarchy, but its reinvention. The difference between the two systems was more than constitutional, it was cultural. In France, political debate was suppressed, dissent silenced, and criticism of the crown unthinkable. In England, parliamentary debates flourished, pamphlets circulated widely, and citizens engaged in open discussion in coffeehouses and assemblies. The English public sphere grew in confidence, encouraged by the knowledge that Parliament could not be silenced by royal decree, and that subjects had the right to petition without fear. Where France glorified the spectacle of monarchy, England celebrated the rhetoric of liberty. The contrast was especially clear in matters of religion. Louis XIV pursued uniformity through the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, expelling Protestants and enforcing Catholic orthodoxy. In England, though far from fully tolerant, the post-revolution settlement leaned toward pluralism. The Bill of Rights, combined with subsequent legislation, secured the Protestant succession, but also acknowledged, however imperfectly, that conscience could not be dictated solely by the crown. The very survival of dissenting traditions in England set it apart from France's pursuit of religious unity under the king's command. For European observers, the divergence between England and France raised profound questions. Which system promised greater stability? Which offered greater prosperity? For much of Louis XIV's reign, France seemed dominant, its armies victorious, its court glittering, its cultural prestige unmatched. England, by contrast, appeared fractious, its politics noisy, its government restrained by endless negotiation. Yet in the long run, the English model proved resilient. By institutionalizing limits on power, it created a system capable of absorbing conflict without collapse. Where French absolutism dazzled in brilliance only to strain under its own weight, English constitutionalism offered durability. The 18th century would make the consequences clear. England's combination of parliamentary government, secure liberties, and expanding commerce laid the foundation for financial innovation and imperial expansion. The Bank of England, the growth of credit, and the rise of trade all flourished under a government bound by law. Meanwhile, France's absolutism, despite its grandeur, struggled under the weight of war debts, social inequities, and the absence of institutional channels for reform. The revolution that engulfed France a century later would be violent and radical, precisely because the system had not allowed for incremental change. Thus, when comparing the paths of England and France at the close of the 17th century, one sees not merely different governments, but different philosophies of power. In France, power was concentrated, theatrical, and fragile. In England, power was divided, negotiated, and enduring. The Bill of Rights of 1689 symbolized that choice, placing England on the path of constitutional liberty at the very moment when much of Europe embraced absolutism. The contrast would echo throughout the continent. Reformers in the Netherlands, philosophers in the German states, and revolutionaries in America and France all studied the English example, contrasting it with the French. The lesson was clear: where liberty is preserved by law, stability can endure. Where power is hoarded without limit, collapse eventually follows. By the dawn of the 18th century, Europe stood at a crossroads of two models: the radiant absolutism of Versailles and the steady constitutionalism of Westminster. The choice made in England did not only alter its own destiny, it offered the world an alternative vision of governance. In that vision, liberty was not the enemy of monarchy, but its foundation, and law was not the rival of power, but its guardian. Yet if abroad, England's constitutional example stood in contrast to absolutism, at home, its true legacy was felt most powerfully in the very heart of political life, within the walls of Westminster itself. In England itself, the legacy of the Bill of Rights has lived on not only in legal texts, but also in the symbolic heart of political life. At Westminster, the very site where the Convention Parliament met in 1689, the document was shaped and delivered. Over time, that building became more than a palace of governance. It became the enduring stage upon which the principles of constitutional liberty were rehearsed, defended, and renewed for each generation. The stones of Westminster carry the memory of that settlement, and the debates that once shook its chambers continue to echo in the rituals and traditions of modern parliamentary life. When one looks at Westminster Hall, the medieval structure where kings once feasted and courts once convened, it is easy to sense the continuity. Here, the principles of Magna Carta were once invoked, and centuries later, the Declaration of Rights was debated and confirmed. Today, that same building still serves as the ceremonial heart of Parliament, linking the present to the struggles of the past. Every session of Parliament that opens beneath the shadow of Westminster reminds members and citizens alike that the liberties they enjoy were born from decisions taken in those very halls. The Bill of Rights has become more than an artifact of 17th century politics. It is a living reference point. In courtrooms across the country, its principles are still cited as foundations of justice. Judges and lawyers continue to invoke its clauses on the illegality of arbitrary imprisonment, on the importance of fair trial, and on the prohibition of excessive punishment. These principles, centuries old, remain the backbone of English jurisprudence. Even in the 21st century, cases concerning the rights of citizens or the limits of governmental power often trace their lineage directly to the statute of 1689. In Parliament, too, the echoes are unmistakable. The principle of free speech in debate, so central to the Bill of Rights, is still the cornerstone of parliamentary privilege. Members of the Commons and Lords speak with the assurance that their words cannot be silenced or punished by the Crown or the courts. This privilege, born out of the struggles of the 17th century, remains one of the defining marks of English political culture. It enables Parliament to function as the voice of the nation, confident that open deliberation is not a risk, but a right. The symbolic power of the Bill of Rights also extends to the very notion of what it means to be English. For generations, statesmen, writers, and citizens have pointed to 1689 as a turning point in the national story. Alongside Magna Carta, it has become a symbol of the English devotion to liberty under law. In times of crisis, whether during the Napoleonic Wars, the World Wars of the 20th century, or the debates over modern constitutional reform, political leaders have invoked 1689 as proof that the English nation stands firmly on the side of freedom, order, and lawful government. Its legacy has also been woven into ceremony. When monarchs are crowned in Westminster Abbey, they do so within a framework established in 1689. They swear to govern according to the laws and customs of the realm, acknowledging that their authority is bounded by statute. The coronation oath itself is shaped by the Bill of Rights, and its companion, the Act of Settlement, embedding the principles of constitutional monarchy into the very ritual of kingship. Thus, every coronation is a reminder that the crown survives not by divine prerogative alone, but by its partnership with Parliament and the law. The cultural resonance reaches beyond formal institutions. In schools, students learn of the Bill of Rights as a foundation of liberty. In public discourse, it is cited as a touchstone for debates about civil rights and government accountability. Museums and exhibitions place it alongside other treasures of the national story, a reminder that freedom is not inherited passively, but secured by deliberate action. The Bill of Rights is not a relic gathering dust, but a symbol constantly renewed by use, reflection, and remembrance. Westminster itself stands as the most visible emblem of this continuity. Tourists and citizens alike walk past its towers and halls, often unaware that within these walls the principles of modern liberty were secured. Yet the very endurance of the building, scarred by fire and rebuilt, damaged by war and restored, mirrors the endurance of the Constitution it represents. Just as Parliament survived the Blitz and continued to meet even in times of national peril, so too the principles of 1689 have survived the storms of history, adapting but never abandoned. In modern Britain, where constitutional questions are still debated, from the powers of Parliament to the role of the monarchy, from human rights to the relationship with Europe, the Bill of Rights remains part of the conversation. Politicians and jurists look back to it as a reminder that change is possible without chaos, that liberty can be preserved through law, and that institutions endure when they are willing to adapt. It is both anchor and compass, anchoring the nation in its historic liberties while guiding it through the challenges of the present. Thus, the Bill of Rights of 1689 is not only a document of its time, but a continuing symbol in English culture and politics. Its principles are etched into the very identity of Westminster, invoked in the courts, practiced in the chambers of Parliament, and remembered in the rituals of monarchy. It tells a story of liberty hard-won and carefully guarded, a story that continues to shape the nation's life. In every debate that insists on the supremacy of law over power, in every judgment that protects the rights of the citizen, and in every ceremony that reaffirms the partnership between Crown and Parliament, the spirit of 1689 lives on. Yet even as its principles became embedded in Westminster and echoed through English life, another question endured. Was the so-called Glorious Revolution truly a revolution at all, or something more modest in scope? From the moment it was named the Glorious Revolution, scholars and commentators have debated whether the events of 1688 to 1689 truly deserved the mantle of revolution. The title itself, with its overtones of triumph and inevitability, suggests a grand upheaval on the scale of those that would later shake France or America. Yet the reality was more complex, and the question of how to interpret the Glorious Revolution has remained one of the most enduring arguments in English historiography. For many traditional historians, it was indeed a revolution, though a uniquely English one. They have emphasized its peacefulness, its lack of widespread destruction, and its reliance on law and precedent rather than violence. By replacing James II with William and Mary, by declaring the throne vacant and reshaping the conditions of monarchy, Parliament redefined sovereignty itself. In this view, the Glorious Revolution was the decisive moment when the Crown yielded to the supremacy of Parliament, and when liberty was permanently enshrined in statute. It was glorious precisely because it achieved so much with comparatively little bloodshed. Others, however, have been more skeptical. They argue that the so-called revolution was less an uprising of a nation than a carefully managed transfer of power engineered by elites. The invitation to William of Orange was not issued by the masses, but by a handful of leading nobles and bishops. The settlement of 1689 primarily secured the privileges of the landowning class, stabilizing property rights and ensuring the dominance of Parliament, an institution still elected by a narrow slice of the population. From this perspective, the Glorious Revolution was not the triumph of liberty for all, but a bargain that entrenched the power of those already in possession of wealth and influence. The debate also touches on the very definition of revolution. Should the term be reserved for moments of radical transformation, when old orders are overturned and new societies are built from the ground up? If so, then 1688 looks modest by comparison. England remained a monarchy, its social hierarchy intact, its economic structures unchanged. For all its significance, the revolution did not bring democracy, nor did it extend rights to the disenfranchised majority. Instead, it limited itself to the immediate crisis, removing a Catholic king whose policies threatened Protestant ascendancy and securing a Protestant succession bound by law. Yet if revolution is understood more broadly as a fundamental shift in political authority, then the Glorious Revolution surely qualifies. Its legacy lay not in sudden social upheaval, but in institutional realignment. The Bill of Rights codified principles that had been contested for centuries: that the monarch could not suspend laws, could not levy taxes without consent, could not keep a standing army without Parliament's approval. These were not minor adjustments, but the formal rejection of absolutism and the establishment of a system where law reigned supreme. The changes may have been orchestrated by elites, but they transformed the constitutional framework for generations. Modern scholarship often finds itself somewhere between these poles. Some historians stress the revolution's continuity with earlier struggles, from Magna Carta to the Civil War, arguing that 1689 was the culmination of a long tradition rather than a dramatic break. Others highlight the international dimension, noting that William of Orange's arrival was as much about European geopolitics, resisting Louis XIV, as it was about English liberty. Still others point out the unintended consequences. The strengthening of Parliament gave merchants and financiers the confidence to fuel economic growth, laying the groundwork for Britain's rise as a global power. The label glorious itself has come under scrutiny. To some, it masks the exclusions and limitations of the settlement. Catholics were further marginalized, dissenters remained outside full equality, and the poor saw little immediate benefit. To others, it rightly captures the achievement of establishing liberty without descending into prolonged conflict. The Revolution's glory in this telling lies in its moderation, its ability to resolve a crisis through compromise rather than catastrophe. The ongoing debates remind us that history is never settled once and for all. Each generation reads 1689 through its own lens. In the 18th century, Whig historians celebrated it as the triumph of Protestant liberty. In the 19th, critics wondered whether it had merely enshrined oligarchy. In the 20th and 21st centuries, scholars have continued to revisit the revolution, weighing its achievements against its exclusions, its symbolism against its realities. What remains beyond dispute is that the events of 1688 to 1689 reshaped the English state. Whether called a revolution, a coup, or a settlement, they altered the balance of power between Crown and Parliament and set precedents that reverberated far beyond England's shores. The debates themselves are part of the legacy, a reminder that liberty is never a finished story, but a subject of constant re-examination. And in that sense, the Glorious Revolution remains alive not only in statutes and ceremonies, but also in the arguments it continues to inspire. And yet, beyond the disputes of historians, the true measure of 1689 lies not only in how it was judged then or later, but in how its settlement still breathes within the fabric of British law and political life today. In modern Britain, the Bill of Rights of 1689 still breathes within the framework of law and the fabric of public life. Unlike many statutes of its age, it was never consigned to obscurity, never replaced by newer words on parchment alone. Instead, its principles endure in courts, in parliamentary privilege, and in the daily conduct of governance. Though centuries have passed, it remains part of the living Constitution, its language still carrying authority in a world unimaginably different from the one in which it was first drafted. Many of its provisions remain legally binding. The prohibition on suspending laws without Parliament's consent still stands as a barrier to executive overreach. The right of subjects to petition the Crown is still recognized, a quiet but powerful affirmation that grievances must be heard rather than suppressed. The ban on excessive bail and cruel or unusual punishment continues to shape the decisions of judges and to safeguard the dignity of justice. The freedom of speech within Parliament, first declared in 1689, remains the cornerstone of parliamentary privilege, protecting representatives from interference or intimidation. These clauses, written at the dawn of constitutional monarchy, still define the limits of authority in the 21st century. The endurance of the Bill of Rights also speaks to the continuity of English constitutional culture. Britain lacks a single written constitution, but it treasures its constitutional statutes, and none is more revered than this one. Alongside Magna Carta and the Habeas Corpus Act, the Bill of Rights is treated not only as law, but as a statement of national identity. It embodies the principle that liberty is best protected by law, and that even the highest offices of state are bound by rules greater than themselves. Its physical presence reinforces its symbolic weight. The original copy of the Bill of Rights, preserved and displayed, serves as a witness to the struggles and triumphs of a nation. Visitors who view the aged parchment see more than ink on vellum. They see a milestone in the long march of liberty, a reminder that the rights they enjoy today were secured through centuries of conflict and compromise. School children who gaze upon it are taught that their freedoms were not accidental, but won, defended, and preserved. Lawyers, legislators, and ordinary citizens alike recognize it as part of their shared inheritance. The Bill of Rights has also influenced debates in modern Britain about the balance between liberty and security, between tradition and reform. When Parliament considers questions of free expression, religious liberty, or the limits of executive power, echoes of 1689 are never far away. Even in discussions about Britain's relationship with Europe or the role of international law, references to the Bill of Rights remind citizens of their distinctive constitutional heritage. It is not invoked as a relic, but as a living principle, an anchor amid the shifting tides of politics. In the cultural imagination, too, it retains its power. Writers and historians continue to place it at the center of England's story, and it often features in exhibitions and commemorations. It is celebrated as part of a lineage of liberty, alongside the struggles of the Civil War and the triumphs of later reform movements. Its resonance lies not only in what it achieved, but in what it represents. The determination of a people to set limits upon power and to safeguard the rights of the governed. In this way, the Bill of Rights bridges past and present. It belongs to the world of William and Mary, but it also belongs to the Britain of today. It links the parliamentary debates of the 17th century with the constitutional arguments of the 21st. It speaks to citizens not only as history, but as law, reminding them that liberty, once secured, must be continually upheld. Thus, the modern legacy of the Bill of Rights is twofold. It is both a functioning part of the legal order and a powerful cultural symbol. Its words are cited in courts and cherished in memory. Its clauses shape the workings of Parliament and inspire reflections on freedom. And as long as it continues to be read, displayed, and remembered, it stands as proof that the settlement of 1689 was not simply an episode in England's past, but a foundation for its present and its future. Yet its meaning reaches beyond the present, carrying us back across the centuries. Across the sweep of centuries, the English Bill of Rights of 1689 stands as both a settlement and a beginning. It settled a crisis that might have torn the kingdom apart, binding Crown and Parliament into a new partnership. Yet it also began a journey, one that would carry the principles of constitutional liberty far beyond England's shores, to America, to Europe, and into the modern world. Its clauses, simple on parchment, reshaped the relationship between ruler and ruled, and its legacy continues to remind us that liberty is never granted once and for all, but safeguarded by vigilance, debate, and law. In Westminster's halls, in the courts of justice, and in the memory of nations, the spirit of 1689 endures, proof that freedom, once written into the life of a people, can become the most enduring inheritance of all.